Well, over this weekend we've been talking to Richard Davis about his book about the buses of Douglas, the centenary, but also we've been covering the Summerland story, and by chance, I mean I didn't know, without thinking about it now, it's come back to me, but you were a policeman, you were on duty that night, and you haven't really talked about it much, but it must, again, bring back haunting memories?
Basically every time I drive past the place, yes, what's left of it.
Can you tell us your story? What happened?
I was at that time stationed at Pull Rose, and obviously the early evening I got a phone call from the station sergeant at Douglas Police Station, which of course was in Athol Street in those days, to say, in his words, Summerland's gone up. And you think, it's what? But anyway, he went on to say that there was a fire and could I go to the Victoria Street church and get the superintendent, who in those days was Bob Corrin. They must have known he was there attending a function, tell him about it and then carry on to the fire. So I hurtled into Douglas and dug him out of the service, told him to go up just round the corner basically to the police station when he'd been told what had happened, and I then carried on to Summerland. And I don't know whether there were other police there or not. I certainly didn't see any. There must have been. I presume somebody must have got there quicker than I did.
And what state was it in by the time you got there?
At that stage, the whole frontage, the upper frontage, which of course was that Oroglass plastic stuff, was more or less engulfed in flames. It was actually leaping from one pane to the next, to the next, to the next, coming across the front of the building. And I went to the Derby Castle MER yard side of it, that is to say the side nearest to Port Jack, because the flames were coming towards the Aquadrome side, and I thought, well, the only chance of getting anywhere near this is to go behind the flames and come in, because I knew there was an entrance there, although funnily enough I'd never been in the building before in my life.
Never been in it?
Never been in. When you think about it, that would have been something that the emergency services could have benefited from if we'd all been taken round that, and indeed any other large building. Then we would have known what to expect if there ever was an emergency, but I didn't. I hadn't a clue what the place was like inside. So anyway, the upshot of it was I went in with the fire brigade, who, needless to say, were all wearing breathing apparatus, and we went up this concrete stairway opposite the MER yard and went up to the various levels to try and get access. And of course the fire doors, as you probably know, for the most part we couldn't open. I think they were either chained or bolted or in some way secured. And anyway, the fire brigade went on up ahead and I sort of followed as best I could with the smoke and everything, which was quite a bit.
Because you had no
absolutely
apparatus.
Nothing, nothing at all. So whether that was wise in retrospect, I don't know. Nobody told me to go into the building, but the alternative was to stand outside and look like a useless spare part and do nothing, which I couldn't do.
Were lots of people coming out of that building as you try and get in?
Yeah, not the way we were going in, but in other parts of it, yes, people were still coming out from further down the Aquadrome side and so on. But we couldn't get across the concrete road bridge which connected the two sides, like the promenade side to the land side, because the flames were already well in control at that level. So anyway, as I say, we got into the other side, and the fire brigade had hoses in there, and it was that hot, the water was cascading down the concrete steps and it was turning to steam around our feet. And when you looked through the gaps between the fire doors, you could see inside just a red glow. It was like looking into the firebox of a steam locomotive. There's just nothing but flame. Anyway, we got higher up and the fire brigade managed to get some people out who unfortunately weren't alive. So it wasn't a rescue mission as far as we were concerned. It was a recovery job, as it turned out. And at first I didn't realise quite what was going on, because they were dragging these people unceremoniously down the steps, sort of bumping them down the concrete steps, and I thought, these people are going to have a headache in the morning. And then I realised that they wouldn't, because they weren't alive any longer. They were blackened, not by flame, but by smoke. They were all, every one of them was quite blackened with the smoke, the plastic, burning plastic.
The Oroglass as well, presumably?
Possibly, I don't know, but there was quite a lot of plastic in the building, and what was actually on fire that they were in contact with, I don't know, but we didn't get a single one out of there alive. It's one of those things that obviously, in hindsight, a lot of people probably all of the people who were in there could have been saved if the right action had been taken right from the start. In other words, evacuate the building immediately. Not to mention if it had been built of maybe different materials, that's something else. But as far as I was concerned, that was my involvement at the time. And then, of course, once I realised that we weren't going to get anywhere and I was actually putting myself at risk, I had to get out of there, and then went downstairs where there was one of the fire service people with a clipboard monitoring the guys who were inside, you know, with obviously for a certain duration of time. They say, right, you've been in X number of minutes, it's time you were coming out, sort of thing. And I explained to him the situation, what was going on. I said, is there anything that I can usefully do? Because obviously I can't do anything inside the building. I don't think anybody could have. And he said, well, before long we're going to be running out of air for the BA sets. So if you could perhaps use your van, because I had a minivan in those days, if you could nip back to the fire station, which of course was in John Street at the back of the town hall, and bring us some more air cylinders. So I tore back there, got 2 or 3 of these big long tanks that would just barely fit in the back of the van, and brought those over, and they were refilling the BA sets there on the promenade to go back in. But I think we probably all realised that even that wasn't going to achieve anything, because the fire had got a really good hold at that stage, and you know, it was beyond control, I think, anyway. So that after that it was just a matter of sort of crowd control and one thing and another, and the rest of it is more or less history. But I was involved subsequently, as you probably know, they used St George's Hall, the ground floor, as a temporary mortuary, and I spent quite a bit of time in there helping to identify bodies and belongings and one thing and another. And some of the bodies were in a bad state. You couldn't tell whether they were male or female, and in fact one of them, if I remember rightly, was identified as a part human remains, turned out to be a plastic chair, which shows you how bad things were. But anyway, the one thing that in retrospect is vaguely amusing is that the 2 sergeants who were like mortuary attendants and were doing this job full time, the chief constable, who was then Frank Whedon, came in one day with a couple of bottles of whiskey, which he gave to these 2 guys, and that was like their stress counselling, you might say.
I was going to ask that because there was nothing like that in those days.
Absolutely nothing.
So you did that one day, then you had to go back to work and carry on?
Well, basically we were quite some time, we were probably a couple of weeks dealing with the aftermath of it, but yeah, I mean, it was one of those things. You volunteered, you're the policeman, you get on with the job, and if you can't take it, well, you find something else to do, you know.
Does it, I mean, you said you pass it, it brings back memories, but does it affect you in other ways?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think so. But the funny thing is, the one thing that kind of sticks with me more than the actual fire itself is, I suppose you'd say, part of the aftermath, because we had an awful lot of belongings that had been obviously dropped by people when they were rushing out of the building, and we collected them all in one of the empty cells in the police station in Athol Street, and there was a great thing, almost like a pyramid, of odd shoes and handbags and bits and pieces, all kinds of things that had been dropped. And that to me was more, I suppose you'd say, poignant than the actual the fire itself and the building and the people that we got out and so forth. The actual abandoned pile of belongings. Weird, really, in a way. But that probably affected me more than any other aspect of it. Just the fact that these things were there, and you didn't at that time know. In fact, we probably never actually knew what had happened to the people whose belongings they were, whether they were ever reunited with them or whether they were victims of the fire. I don't know.